Well, there have been protests in the Pacific nation of Cook Islands over recent moves by the government to sign an agreement with China, as well as suggesting the introduction of its own passport. Around 400 protesters gathered outside the parliament, demanding the Prime Minister Mark Brown not endanger a long-standing pact which guarantees residents New Zealand citizenship and other benefits. Both countries retain close constitutional ties, but New Zealand was angered by a recent suggestion by Mr. Brown for Cook Islands to have its own passport. The Prime Minister had also signed a strategic agreement with China during a recent visit to Beijing that's raised concerns in Wellington. And earlier today, the Cook Islands government revealed more about that agreement it signed with China, and our foreign affairs reporter Stephen Dziedzic has been examining the details.
Look, we know a little bit more now, Girish. The Cook Islands government's released what it's called the action plan for its strategic partnership with China. This is a bit of a broad, overarching document that describes in broad terms exactly what the two countries would like to do together, although it doesn't get down into specifics. Now, most of this document would read as a pretty innocuous one. There's a lot of talk about cooperation in things like culture and energy, renewable energy, but there are a few things that will probably catch the eye of strategists and analysts in both Wellington and elsewhere. In particular, a reference in the document to setting up consular missions in both countries, suggesting that China might like Cook Islands to set up some sort of representative office in China, and that it might look at doing the same, setting up a mission in Cook Islands, in Rarotonga, rather than relying on its High Commission, its embassy rather, in Wellington, as well as unsurprisingly discussions about the importance of cooperation on joint transport, and also on potentially working together on deep sea mining and mineral exploration. Now, what isn't included are some of the other documents which were also signed during Mark Brown's visit to China, and which are potentially likely to cause quite a bit of anxiety in New Zealand. And we saw a statement from a spokesperson this afternoon from Winston Peters, the Foreign Minister of New Zealand, saying they welcome this document, this overarching document being made public, but they still want the government of Cook Islands to release and make public the other more detailed agreements as soon as possible. And they say it's only when those documents have been released that they can make a full assessment of exactly the scope of the cooperation that's being considered and what that might mean for the relationship and for New Zealand's security, as well as regional security more broadly. So yes, this is definitely a win for transparency that this document is out there, but New Zealand is saying it's only a first step, and it's demanding full transparency from Mark Brown to put all of the other documents, particularly the ones you suspect that might touch on things like seabed exploration, deep sea mining, potential cooperation on maritime infrastructure and the like. So those topics with potential security implications, New Zealand wants those documents out in the public as well.
Yes, you spoke of reactions by New Zealand, but we saw quite the reaction in Cook Islands today, some very rare protests. So what's triggered the public anger?
Look, it's a complicated picture, and obviously I'm in Canberra, not in Cook Islands, so it's difficult to get a detailed idea. But just going by what people on the ground who we spoke to today are saying, and what else has been reported from other media outlets who were on the ground, it's clear the main thing that's driving this protest that we saw in Rarotonga today is anxiety about New Zealand's relationship with Cook Islands. And I think the thing that most people on the ground were perhaps most anxious about was actually a slightly separate issue, a push that Mark Brown raised a few months ago, which came to a head last week, for Cook Islands to issue its own passports, something that New Zealand did not want to see. It argued it crossed a red line with their association, their agreement of free association, and something that New Zealand warned could endanger Cook Islanders' access to things like permanent residency and citizenship, as well as the other benefits that they enjoy in New Zealand. Now, New Zealand was probably very unlikely to actually take that step. I think the worst it would have done would probably be to deny people who actually applied for this new passport from those benefits. I don't think it was ever contemplating withdrawing those benefits full stop to everyone in Cook Islands, but the prospect of a rupture of that nature, and of course the prospect of them losing that connection to New Zealand and all the benefits that flow from it, was something that clearly stirred quite a bit of unease in Cook Islands. And the main main message, as best as I could tell from a distance from most people on this protest, was that they weren't in favour of Mark Brown doing anything that might endanger the relationship with New Zealand, or more critically perhaps endanger their access to New Zealand passports. That's something that people during that protest, which was very good-natured broadly, I have to say, although passionate, something that they did not want to see.
On Mark Brown, though, he did say that there was no need for New Zealand to be in the room when the deal was signed when he was in Beijing. So what can we expect when he next meets with his counterpart in New Zealand?
Yeah, look, it could be quite a frosty meeting, I suspect. When Mark Brown said that he would shelve the passport proposal that has stirred so much anger, he did this a couple of weeks ago, he said that New Zealand had, quote, bared its teeth over the issue, which is why he was putting it to one side. An answer that points to quite a bit of bad blood, you'd have to say, at least on the Cook Islands side. And it's well known as well that there are pretty deep frustrations in New Zealand's foreign ministry about many of the things that Mr. Brown has been doing. So it could be something of a tense meeting. I think what's going to be critical here is really whether or not Mark Brown releases these other documents that have been signed with China. New Zealand is saying that they believe that he has an obligation to do so. They were frustrated that he didn't share the contents of the agreements before they were signed in Harbin last week. That basically came down to a disagreement of how to interpret a series of agreements that have been signed between the two countries, including a critical joint declaration from 2001, which includes language on consultation, which is, to be fair, a bit ambivalent or a bit grey and vague at times. But I think the big question now is how will New Zealand respond? Well, how might it put more pressure on Mark Brown to release the rest of these agreements? And if he doesn't, what additional steps might New Zealand take to try and persuade or even force him to do so?
OK, Stephen Dziedzic in Canberra, thanks very much for your insights into this story.
Thanks, Girish. Appreciate your time.